from here on, starting at about 7:15, you can start your final projects. So, good luck. See you in January. Tonight it gives me great pleasure to welcome Mark Jarzombek to the School of Architecture. Mark is a professor in history, theory, and criticism at MIT, where he's taught since 1995, and is also the associate dean of the School of Architecture and Planning. Before MIT, Mark taught at Cornell and was a fellow at the Getty Center, the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton, as well as the Canadian Center for Architecture in Montreal. His books include On Leon Battista Alberti, The Psychologizing of Modernity. That's his second book, that's not a subtitle of the first one. Though he does interesting history, that's not one of them. And most recently, a textbook entitled A Global History of Architecture. His writings span from Wolfman and Ruskin to Johnson and Hans Hacke, from the Pantheon to the good life modernism. Looking at Mark's CV, you immediately come to the conclusion that he's a very serious guy. After doing his undergraduate studies at the University of Chicago, a serious place, Mark received his architectural diploma from the ETH in Zurich, also a very serious kind of place, and finally his PhD from MIT, also a serious place. Trained as a general humanist, an architect, and a historian, there are very few people who are more intimidating and enlightening to be on a design review with than Mark. He is one of the closest readers of architecture, and his close readings go from the technique of the drawing, to the form, to the programmatic implications, and someone who can take that attention to detail and immediately land you in an unexpected big picture place. He is, in a word, frankly, annoying to be on a review with, because after he starts, it's very hard to think of anything left to say. So, yeah, I agree with Mark. Worst of all, and what belies that CV seriousness, is that he's incredibly entertaining and funny the entire time. Mark is one of the most theatrical reviewers I've ever seen. He wears his erudition lightly, and it's always a great pleasure to be sitting with him on those occasions. More importantly, Mark is always looking for the twist, and I suppose that's why we find kind of sympathy with Mark's position here at the school. In the sense that he's always relentless in challenging the pet cliches and commonplace assumptions that achieve consensus at any particular moment in the field. He's done this, much to my pleasure, in this case, in critically examining the incoherent discussions surrounding sustainability and his general call to take back architecture from the ethicists and the engineers. More recently, in his essay on the corridor, which appeared in Critical Inquiry, he takes on, among other things, Robin Evans' ahistorical critique of the corridor, and since I often use that text, though not for those reasons, I put myself on notice that I will correct that in the future, so I take the critique personally. Tonight's lecture is called The Global Paradox, and I expect we will be witness to the same kind of take-no-prisoners approach to unraveling another of those current cliches that many take to be gospel. It's quite a trick for someone in the field to keep it both honest and smiling at the same time, but Mark is able to do it. Thank you, Mark. Please join us in the key Mark.
Like I'm turning a corner. I mean, this building is lovely, but it's also oddly strange. Thanks, Bob, for the introduction. It's great to be here. I don't have a screen for some reason. And I see that there's a lot of work all around here in the studios, and I know you're all very busy, so I appreciate you taking the time to come and discuss me tonight. As you know, I wrote a textbook called The Global History of Architecture, and this gives what I want to do tonight is, in some sense, do a little bit of a backstory on that, some of the things that came up as we were writing this, because when we started the project, we were maybe somewhat naive. We thought, well, someone should write a textbook like this. Maybe we finally realized, well, why can't we do it? If we want to talk about it happening, if we can't do it, then we shouldn't expect others to do it. So Vikram, Prakash, and I spent 6 years of our lives madly writing and researching and traveling around the world looking at the buildings. And at the end, we sort of were both optimistic, but also, in a funny way, left with a certain oddly taste for the impossibility, really, of doing a textbook like this. So what does it mean when we do global? Of course, everyone thinks global is the, is the next best thing, and we all have to do it. It now mandates, global in your history courses. But of course, global doesn't exist. The globe exists, and history exists, but global history doesn't exist. So, it has to be in some sense invented again and again and again. We're just at the beginning. 300 years from now, we'll have many global histories, hopefully many better than even the ones that we tried to do. So the pieces of it, how do we learn about it? So we have to go to building history, local history, regional history, national history, geographic history. I mean, these are sort of categories that sort of exist. This is a category that sort of doesn't exist, but that you need in order to sort of get to something that we would call global, to figure out the own story. So we all know if you talk about the Taj Mahal, you have to, look at the building history. You have to understand sort of its context. You have to know its relationship to sort of Indian culture. You have to know the broader relationship to the practices of the time. But then you can say all that, but that's still not global. So global is still an extra valence, an extra sort of capacity to sort of relate these things to other types of problems. So in some sense, you need all of these things, but you also got to do something that's different. And that difference is where you both have to be creative, but also have to find sort of the struggle to articulate the problem and what could be interesting to students. Now, the model we're working against was what we call the UL Plus model, which is how I was trained. In school, you had Europe, which is sort of, of course, clearly includes Egypt, and then, North America. And then there's the plus, which is China and India or other places that you brought in for specialists. So, everyone was afraid, I don't know anything about Chinese architecture, we'll get the Chinese specialists to come and give a lecture on China or India or the Americas. So that was sort of the model, and it's used by many professors still today. And it's, respectable, but we were arguing this can't be global, this is not global. So here's a classic example of a textbook. It's interesting. Well, it's not what I see. Just washed out, but anyway, it doesn't really matter. You get it here. There's Egypt, Greece, Rome, Europe, right? And China, right? So you can just sort of forget these chapters, of course, or you can just read them. That goes to the plus chapters, right? But basically, the historical lineage goes on in the standard way, and then you have a few chapters on the sort of oddball countries that are out there in the world. So there are several fallacies that we have to sort of work against. One is that the non-West has to be taught by specialists in the field. This is sort of the usual fallback. I don't know anything about Chinese. Let me find somebody who knows something about Chinese. Well, a specialist in Chinese is probably good because they will know something, but it may not be appropriate, if you will, for architectural students because they maybe come from art history, and it's not yet integrated into the global thing. Specialists on Chinese will know a lot about China, but when I traveled to China with Chinese specialists on a fellowship, none of them had ever been either to Mongolia, none of them had been to India, none of them had been to Southeast Asia, so they know a lot about China, but global is not China. Global is China plus. The other fallacy is you're going to encounter this in NAB because NAB says we have to do global, and then they say, what is global? And they say global is teaching the students about indigenous and vernacular architecture. Okay? So in other words, the assumption is that you go out to the globe to find poor people who don't know anything about architecture and are not very civilized and do huts. Right? Well, of course, just tell that to the Indians or the Chinese or anybody, and they'll just laugh you off the face of the earth. So the NAB, I'm just writing a piece now basically explaining the silliness of this NAB requirement and the assumption that the non-West is filled with vernacular people. As if it didn't have civilization before the West. But anyway, you're going to be required, your teacher is going to be required to teach you vernaculars, because that's what map says. So it comes, basically out of the 19th century. And then, of course, that the architecture of the non-West is somehow authentic, belonged prior to the colonialism and modernism. Basically, architecture is never authentic, and so why should it be particularly authentic just because it comes from the non-West? So these are particular fallacies that we have that we should protect ourselves against. It doesn't say yet what global is, but yeah, I'll get to that in a moment. But we certainly know what I think global is not, and that's sort of the problem. So for us, so here's our globe from our book, and you see all the little dots, and basically the point of this little map is that we took out all national boundaries, right? So it's history, if you will, without borders, or at least without modern borders. And this is a critical point, because history today, as is often taught and conceptualized, is taught through the lens of the modern border. So if we're going to do global, the first thing we've got to do is get rid of the modern border. Well, it turns out to be not as easy as you think. So I'm going to give you two little case studies of the projects of history that we sort of encounter. So one, of course, is early history. We think, how does it start? How does it begin? How do we work? So this is the map of how I was taught. Basically, you had Egypt, you had Mesopotamia, they invented the cities and so forth like that. And then somewhere over here, a little fuzzy, no one really knows, there's some Chinese, something happening. India didn't happen at all. At least when I was taught, we knew that they made something, but it was sort of in the Hindu style. So that was how I was taught, and maybe still how. And then over here, Stonehenge, of course, up here, no one knows what they're doing, but they're doing something weird, and that's sort of the end of the story. Well, funny things happen. In the early 20th century, around 1910 or so, the English were building a railroad through an area in northern India, and they were discovered that as they were building the bridges, that there were a lot of bricks lying around in the desert. And so they used these bricks to make the trellises for the railroad. And then someone took the train and happened to see one of these bricks, and brought it back to London, and they analyzed it, and it turned out to be 7,000 years old, 7,000 BC. And they said, well, that's impossible. There's nothing here, 7,000 BC. So they brought some archaeologists, and they found an old civilization, the Indus civilization, that starts about 7,000 to 8,000 BC and goes to 1,500 BC. Then around 1,500 BC, the Indus River, the Ganga River, there was a big earthquake. It moved, it shifted about 10 or 15 miles, and all of these cities, basically that were along the river, died because the waterway had now moved, and so the civilization collapsed. One of the great sort of environmental collapses perhaps of all time. So it's a very interesting story. We know a lot about it now, and it's very sort of complex. And so it's a huge territory, which sort of gives you a sense of scale, right? It's larger than the size of France. And this is not anything primitive, nothing vernacular here. These were large cities built out of burnt brick, not mud brick, but burnt brick. So that's why they're still there today. That's why they were used by the English to build their bridges. And you can sort of see the emergence of archaeological dig. Water was a big feature of the brick. They had sanitation systems, they had sewage systems, water, baths. Is a truly remarkable thing. So all of a sudden, we realized the world that seems sort of pretty empty now is actually filled with things. 20, 30 of these impressive towns. The archaeology is still going on. It's in Pakistan, so archaeology is sort of slightly slower than it is before, which is sort of perhaps the same. So, but of course, when you go in many of your textbooks and you would type in Indus Valley, this is what you're going to get. It's a typical map that you encounter today. The world is all white except where you're talking about, as if no one else lived in the entire world. So, maps like this are sort of, unfortunately, precisely bad for the educational system because they sort of show that, nobody lives except where you're interested, which is sort of a quasi-national project. So then, about 10 years ago, they discovered in the middle of the area here from the RLC, another culture. I'm called the BMAC people because we don't know their official name yet. pre-writing. But the Andro Novo, based around a village, is a large metallurgical culture, and there's BMAX down there, factory culture, and they made there's several cities, giant cities, beautiful cities laid out on grids. This is Gonor, and you can see the different functional, the entrance, the palace, the temple. This is the wine storage, different parts of it. They made these beautiful statues. So this is about, you can see from the date of this, it's 2400 BC. So this is before Ziggurat of Ur. Of course, you can't teach the story of the history of architecture without mentioning the Ziggurat of Ur. But, well, I mean, the Ziggurat of Ur, that comes after Gonur, right? So all of a sudden, we have whole new worlds opened up to us. So we have to accommodate the Gonur people. And then, of course, we're looking archaeologically now in much more interesting ways than we did in the past. So here we see a town in the Turkish-Syria border, and basically it was a quarry. So basically we have now archaeologists who were originally focused a lot on just big cities. Now they're looking at these sort of towns that have specialized production systems. So these guys made only stone blocks for buildings. And of course, they didn't have time to do anything else, which meant that the economy was strong enough you could make a stone block, put it on a cart, and go bring it down to war, and you would get grain and whatever you needed back, right? So it's an exchange economy, but you have now so very focused economic urban conditions. Another town was only specialized in bitumen. The Ziggurat of Ur is bricks are glued together by bitumen that sort of oozes out of the ground in Iraq. And one town, just all it did was made bitumen into little balls, and then you could sort of put those onto the parts and sort of use it building. So basically buildings and architectural production were now sort of put together. And this is where shows you where it is in Turkey. So our site gets sort of more complicated. So I don't have to go through the list, but I'm just sort of saying if we add all of the things that we know now into our map, we get a very different map. The map is filled with stuff, with realities. So we have the Indus people. The Indus people were trading with the BMAC. The BMAC people we know were trading all the way over here because of similar types of seals that they use. And then of course we have the Egyptians going sort of gangbusters. And then we have trade happening with the Europeans, gold and metal. And then down here we have the pastoral societies exchanging hides and milk. And then we have village societies here. So then we have this red line is a sort of the urban line. Everything below this red line is sort of cities. Everything above the red line is sort of village industries. Right? So if you're a metallurgical village in the mountains, you don't really make cities. So as much as we can celebrate the creation of these cities in 3000 BC, we always have to remember there is an economic reality to the north, which is largely about metal, which is filtering the metals down. Grain, of course, is going up. So we have these grain world cities, metal world villages, and their sort of interaction zone. So this is a very, very different type of story than the story of how great cities were made in Ur, and then how we all, in some sense, became urbanized. So we have to, in some sense, tell the global story in a very different way. It's no longer a story of sort of disparate realities, disconnected from each other, and having their own sort of local and sort of quote-unquote indigenous identity, but the stories of interaction, a story that is itself already, if you will, global. Right? So global is something that we just discovered, accidentally 5 years ago because of NAB. Global happened already 3,500 BC. It's just that we haven't understood it. It's not us who are not global, right? We're in fact sort of the least global in many of our ways historically than the people were sort of back then. The problem we encounter, of course, if you want to tell the story, is that if you go to archaeologists, an archaeologist who works in Jordan, and you can see all the dots on the map, the dots that he's interested in, but because his funding probably comes from Jordan, he's only going to tell you the dots that are in Jordan. right? You see the dots in Israel, right? This is the same time period. But the guy working in Israel, he's not going to give you the dots in Jordan because he's scared he may, there's not anything like that. Well, I don't really care about this. I want to know the dots together, right? So if you do global, you've got to work against the sort of the nation-based positioning of scholarship. Scholarship is so saturated with these sort of projects that it's very hard to do if you go to global. And part of the global is in some sense to overcome this. So one would think global is some sort of a new way of thinking, but it also has to do with resisting the ways of thinking that exist in art history, and in this case in archaeology, in the various representations. Right? So it just sort of stands to reason that if I want to tell the story about the Bronze Age, I'm not going to show the modern era border between Jordan and Israel. That would be absolutely nonsensical. But archaeologists, of course, would operate in this way. So this just gives a little bit of a taste of even sort of beginning the story, even sort of telling how the architectural history sort of begins. The information we get has to be in some sense filtered and critiqued. The second sort of a little bit of a case study is going to be focused on Armenia. I just want to say at the beginning, I'm not Armenian, because Armenians we feel very passionate about that, and Armenians will sort of sing the praises of their homeland, but I'm doing it just as a interested scholar. But first, let's sort of say, where is Armenia? Well, I do feel a little bit sorry for the Armenians, because inevitably, a map that you'll find in the textbooks, Armenia is always cut right in half. Right? So, okay, that's because we're in Europe. But, the Armenian soccer team plays with Europeans. Right? So the Armenians see themselves as Europeans. So they play with the European soccer matches. It's interesting that the Turkish soccer league plays with the Arab soccer league. So, anyway, but the Europeans really haven't quite put the Armenians in this map. I'm just showing you two maps. I can show you endless amount of maps, right? And the poor Armenians are sort of always sort of half on and half off. The machine here is a little bit oversaturated, but I'll just take my word for it. So what is the Armenia that we're talking about? It's sort of complicated because you got to remember in the days before nation states, borders were like jellyfish. They sort of expanded and contracted and did all sorts of things, right? So basically, we're looking at sort of an area that's on the border of several countries today. And one of the reasons it's very hard to find a coherent book on Armenia is because you have to go to 7 different countries today if you're an Armenian scholar. And many of these countries are, you can, if you want to go to here, right, to Syria, well, you have to go to Cyprus to go to Syria, and if you want to get to Iraq, well, I don't know how you would do that. I'm not going to do it through Syria, and I'm probably not going to be able to do it for a long, long time. Then, of course, you do Azerbaijan, but you have to wear a bulletproof vest because there's a lot of bombing going on. You have to go through 7 different countries. It would take you incredibly difficult, painful time to do it. So, Armenian scholarship sort of like doesn't have it. So even on that count, you sort of see that we've got to remember, history just doesn't come on trees. It has to be constructed, it has to be produced, it has to be visited and made. Now, why my little focus on Armenia? So let me give you a little quick map, and these are some of the maps that are going to be in our sort of second edition. So this is sort of the rough sort of diagram of the power map of about 600 CE. You had the Roman Empire, then you got over here Chang'an. Chang'an, as you know, hopefully I know, was the largest city in the world at the time of 1.5 million people. It was the great metropole of Eurasia, and as well as Rome. So you had 2 giant cities, mega cities with 1.5 million people. And in between were a lot of little small cities, and these were cities where the Silk Route, was sort of interacting back and forth. The Silk Route went in various ways, up between these 2 cities. And so one route went sort of the north route, and then the Roman Empire was little bit worried that the Parthians were getting too uppity, and so they created the sort of the southern route through Petra, south through Ethiopia, India, and then up and so forth. These were the two classical routes. But then something happened, which was that there was a trade disruption around 700. One was largely because the Islam, as it was starting to be created under Muhammad, there was a lot of friction, civil wars taking place, and the trade routes were disrupted in Arabia. The other problem took place in the Taklamakan Desert, which is right here, which is the area, the desert, through which you had to go through to get to China. And in around the year 800, there was a global warming. Global warming isn't just today. There are many ups and downs. And the year 100, plus or minus, many decades, was a period of global warming. The Taklamakan Desert was you can move across it, that's navigatable, because the rivers from the mountains, the Himalayas, would flow down to the edges of the desert, and then you could go from one river to another river and go along the edges of it. Well, when these died out, you couldn't do that anymore, and basically the Silk Route came to an end as we know it. So this meant that there's a global shift in the regional economy began to take place. So as the ecological disruption took place in the Silk Route, basically all the energy and the force and the wealth basically went south. And the Chinese now opened up trade routes to the south, the Indians connected trade routes to China, and all of a sudden we see a lot of dots taking place of large architectural projects, large city projects, because now wealth was flowing into South Asia and Southeast Asia. Meanwhile, what's happening over here is that we have a huge sort of disruption of the economic world here, and so this wealth had to go up and across the Caspian Sea through this dot here. This was Armenia, and basically that meant Armenia, if you will, was like the Memphis, Tennessee of the FedEx. Every package that went from the east, that was going this way, and vice versa, had to go through Armenia. So, of course, every package went through it, there was a price markup, right? There was a tax, and the Armenians became fabulously wealthy. So to understand Armenian architecture, you've got to understand the changing geopolitical environment that made Armenia, all of a sudden, basically, from the year 600 to about the year 800 or 900, the economic hub of the Euro-Asia-European world. So they weren't at the perimeter, they were at the center. So our maps are wrong. So if you do a map of 800, it has to be Armeniocentric. So this, once again, right, is a difficulty we encountered with maps, that maps are always done from a very modern perspective. So we needed to sort of redraw maps, basically so that you can see it from this particular perspective. Then around the year 1000 or so, the things got complicated because Islam sort of began to sort of control the trade routes, and they, of course, began to sort of extend this trade route into Spain and so forth. But still, this is a very small funnel in which a vast amount of wealth, the wealth of Eurasia, is going through, right? And Europe at this time, this is still the backwater of the world, right? 800, I mean, we're getting into some interesting stuff. But basically in 800, Europe was in the proverbial Dark Ages. Back, or if you think of this, this was the world power, the world of power, you know, this is what, look at all of these dots. Look at everything that's happening in Asia and Southeast Asia. Look at the two dots here, right? Everything's got to go through here. And then there's something starting to happen in Europe, but, you know, still not very much. Of course, eventually, the flow of all this is going to go up here, right? And basically salvage the European world, you know, from its own sort of misery. But the story still, if you will, before then, is this story of a very small band, if you will, of reality. So if we look a little bit closer at Armenia, the different types of trade routes that go there, in different cities, we have Ani, which was a city of maybe 400,000 people, giant city. You know, the largest city in Europe in the year 600 was Rome. I mean, it was then it shrunk to I think like 30,000 people. Paris was maybe 10,000 people. You know, these were large sort of environments. Unfortunately, of course, Ani, as you all know, is in the political problem of being right on the Turkish border, inside the Turkish border, and most of it is being destroyed by the Turks. Now, so that sort of tells us why Armenia is sort of important. As a place, it doesn't give us the architectural story. The architectural story, I'm sorry for the washed out slide here through the machine, but you can sort of see there's Italy, there's Armenia, and then there's some circles here. So here's. And this is the story of the map that I just made, very primitive map, nothing particularly complicated about it, of materials. So we have in Egypt, we have the mud brick. We have in India, we have wood. In China, we've got wood. In Persia, Sasanian, we got mud brick. In Europe, we've got sort of stone and rubble. And in Byzantium, we have brick. But in Armenia, in Cilicia, this area here, we have stone. So this is a typical Sasanian. Go back. Uh-oh, I'm doing something. Hands off. Yeah, okay. That's good. Thank you, whoever. All right. These are just a question of materials. What materials were architects using at the time? The same Antinoj, an amazing building, mud brick, not going to last very long. It was covered with a veneer of marble, they're like postmodern, right? The marble, of course, is all gone because it was stolen over the centuries and centuries by people who wanted to use it for their building projects. So all we got left is in some sense sort of pile of the mud bricks. Then we have the Byzantine architecture with beautiful vaults and so forth and so on. But the work itself is a mixture of brick, rubble, arbitrary things lying around in the neighborhood. It's not a particularly beautiful building, so to speak. I mean, nothing against Byzantine architecture. I love it as it is, right? But if I'm a stonemason, I'm thinking, it's pretty bad. And then of course we have the 10th century churches, which are great buildings. We all love them, and they're sort of beautiful and old. And this is you ignore this. This is sort of a 14th century building when they learned how to make bigger windows. But basically, these are stone rubble buildings, very thick stone. They're afraid of making arches because they crumble, right? So very teeny tiny little windows, right? Oh God, don't make any windows at all. God forbid. So it's an okay building into itself. It's sort of interesting, but you can sort of see they're working with a very difficult material. It was a stone rubble. They had forgotten about concrete, of course, and so they made things very thick. In India at the time, we have wood. Of course, this is sort of a modern thing. This is a bit of a reconstruction because these things haven't survived over thousands of years. But this would have been something what an Indian temples would have looked like. There was at the time no stone used in the temples. But we go to Armenia, right? So if I'm an architect living in the year 600, and I'm interested in stone, there's only one place to go. This would be Armenia. And it's not just junk stone, right? This is a good stone, right? Beautifully carved, beautifully squared, They don't have a problem with arches, and they don't have a problem with vaults, and they have all the languages that you expect of the survival of the sort of Hellenistic culture that came out of the pagan world. It's now being adapted and used and translated into Christian churches. So it carries with it the attention to the detail that goes back to the Parthenon, or however you want to go back, you want to go. But basically, it's a Hellenistic sort of project that is now continuing and surviving through this age. So here we see the vaults. The buildings were sort of beautiful volumes with the windows. They had these sort of towers that erupted out of the top that became later the prototype of the steeple. So they were inventing new types of forms. The vaults, the arches, with the architraves, with the voussoirs. And the reason these buildings still exist is that some of the material, the mortar they're using, is ortolano, which is a cement like concrete cement. So now they didn't forget about porcelain, right? The guys in Europe did. They didn't forget it. So they're doing buildings that actually are at the cutting edge and remarkable in their design, in their invention, in their use of openings and lights and volume. We can just sort of revel at this. This is the date, 618, right? And this is sort of already 200 years, basically, of these churches that were at the high end of architectural production at the time. So if you had just graduated from an architectural school and you wanted to go to the latest, thing, you'd go to Armenia. This would be where, if we think computation is where it is today, Armenia is where it was at in the 7th century. So, unfortunately, these things are semi-ruinous often, but they give you a good taste of the durability of these buildings. So we should all go visit. Anybody been to Armenia? Visited some of these things? I'm just always curious. And I confess I haven't gone there. I was supposed to go last summer, but something came up, and I'm going next summer to look at the sites. And then we had Ani, which would have been one of the large cities of the world, 100 to 200,000 people. As you can see, there's nothing left of the city at all. And you can ask me what this is. Anybody know what that is? Building? None of you are stonemasons. Well, basically, what you want to do is you have a lot of good limestone. You take the limestone and you put it in the kiln, and then you can make a mortar out of it. So you basically then use the mortar to build your modern buildings down wherever you want to do it. So basically, the entire city was a quarry and has been basically obliterated just so that you can make basically some cement. So from cement to cement, I guess, dust to dust, or ashes to ashes, and all that's left is this one beautiful church. It's one of the great tragedies, of the modern political era. Anyway, that's just a little bit aside. So the point here is that we have here a place, a zone in sort of the history of the world where dressed stone was produced, manufactured, buildings were built of an extraordinary nature. And it was unique. So I had an atom bomb sort of gone off on this spot. The history of architecture would have been significantly different. Then around here, then there's a problem, of course. What happens is that there's the Exodus. Islam comes in. They borrow these artisans. They bring them to help them produce their buildings. Some of them flee into Europe, into South France. We see Armenian architecture being built. The German, the Ottonian kings, they had a thing for Byzantine girls, princesses, I should say. And so when they would come down and they would marry a Byzantine princess, she would bring with her artisans and craftsmen and dressmakers and all that type of stuff. So we have, lists of the things that these princesses brought up, including architects. So the architectural culture sort of navigates with it. And of course, we know from documents Armenian masons made their way through Islamic connections all the way into India. So this is the world. So 500 CE, roughly, let's say, so if you're looking only at advanced stone, that's about it. But then something totally remarkable happens. As you sort of begin to move within the developments of sort of Islam and religion and the flow of the traffic, right? So it's not just wealth and bales of silk that are being moved, but also architectural knowledge. So you sort of see that between sort of 618 from San Spremment, but we're working here down to Borobudur. By the time we get 800, it's only 200 years. You have a stone building of truly remarkable scale and proportion. It's not built by Armenians. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that there is a sort of technology transfer that gets produced as the culture, as the ideas, as the project of advanced stonework becomes, if you will, internationalized. And people borrow, exchange, and multiply this thing. So they can see the spread, very rapid spread, from Bhubaneswar in India to Borobudur in 800, which is one of the buildings perfectly designed to withstand earthquakes. It has this sort of internested stone technology, and truly one of the great stone buildings of all time. It gets down to Sri Lanka, 900, and even you can notice even here the stylobate, like in a Greek classical temple with the steps. So there are sort of tropes and attributes of Hellenism that are still surviving. The string courses, the layering, and so forth. Of course, in India, right, this becomes sort of a culture unto itself and sort of explodes almost all across sort of the Indian subcontinent into things that we still recognize: columns, and tablatures, dentals, and the sort of whole attributes of a type of late something very Hellenistic thing. The Mosque of Ibn Tulun in 869, one of the great stone buildings in Cairo, one of the first stone buildings, very much looking like a Roman causeway or aqueduct. And so we get sort of a map. So if we sort of, that shows sort of the extent of this sort of advanced stone culture that sort of stretches all the way from Indonesia into Cairo, and then of course is brought into Spain onward. So right, you can follow the line, and down the line it should probably extended sort of even further. And then you can sort of see the carriers. Who are the carriers? Well, we have the Umayyad, then we have the Abbasid, the Arabs, then we have the Pala in India, the Chola in India, and the Sriwijaya in Indonesia. These are the sort of carriers really of these technologies as the technologies advanced or borrowed While all of this was happening, just go back to Europe and you'll find this. No, I mean, it's beautiful, it's great. It just doesn't measure up to anything that we've seen so far. Compare that to Angkor Wat. I mean, you cannot go to Angkor Wat and just fall in love with the beautiful geometry of these columns, with the beautiful way in which you can sort of still recognize these are designed by Indian masons that were brought to Cambodia by the kings, because they were thoroughly sort of Indianized. When then that culture of these advanced stone work is sort of brought here, extended, and perfected into its own sort of way. So this passageway here would have had a wooden coffered ceiling over it. You wouldn't actually have seen that. So imagine sort of a flat roof, sort of hung roof on the city. So this is really sort of a remarkable story about how one type of technology, sort of stone, if you will, begins to move in the trade networks. So we can trace it from a type of Armenian center. I'm not trying to put everything onto Armenia, but I'm sort of saying that there was a moment when Armenia that area was the only place that did it. And then it spreads into Hindu architecture, Buddhist architecture, Islamic architecture, and finally, you can begin to see advanced European Christian architecture about 1000 CE or so, which is sort of the length of the Europeans sort of who got to this, the end of the line, right? By the time they sort of began to sort of, and of course, the Europeans did fantastic things with it. By the time they get to the Romanesque and the Gothic, it just went, fantastic places. But still, there was a sudden bump up that took place here that, is really, 300 years late compared to what's happening in Islamic countries in Southeast Asia. All right, so that is a type of global story that we're interested in. Now, you can say, well, Oh, okay, no, no, no. But basically, you're not going to find your story anywhere because we made the story. If I had given you the standard global story, I would have told you something about Indian architecture as a static entity. I would have told you something about Cambodian architecture, but I wouldn't have mentioned maybe India, or Korean architecture, or Iranian architecture. The history of architecture, the history of art, is basically seen so pervasively through the silos of these modern national countries that it's very hard to talk about trans-geographical, trans-continental global flows for which architecture story is sort of is a critical element. So here again, we're facing sort of a problem of our culture not being in some sense global enough to understand how to do global, which is extraordinarily frustrating. So if you think of, go back, talk a little bit to the 50s, we had modernization, no one was really interested in history, and there was a sort of post-colonial nationalism, industrialization. And then we think today, we're so cool, we got globalization, we're at the forefront of a new, more inclusive, liberal type of understanding of history. But the problem is that we have produced two things. We have produced a globalized network of little gadgets that I can talk to. My son has this friend in India, a girlfriend in India, and he can talk to her anytime he wants, and he thinks he's globalized. But while all that is happening, we have produced really the worst form of a type of 19th century nationalist history that haunts our global project again and again. It's not everywhere, but it's such a pervasive problem that it has to be in some sense addressed. So this is sort of the old school. This is how I was educated. This was the important stuff. Certain experts did all that stuff. You really didn't have to learn it unless you were a graduate student. Right? Today we have something like this. This is global, which is every country has the right to have its own history. A little book on each country, and you have to learn something about each of these countries and basic facts. And then you add to that the fact that all of these countries have their national museums. So we have the Mexican Museum, we have the English Museum, the British National Museum, the Korean National Museum, the Japanese National Museum, all of these countries. In fact, the national museums have become a new type of pathology in our contemporary political world. And it's astonishing how many national museums have been built only in the last 15 years, right? Now, of course, the English started it, and they gave the Germans and the Scandinavians and the Americans, and now everyone wants it. I get that. That's fine. Everybody maybe should have a national museum, but it's of course just producing the long lag of this problem into our current world. Right? So we have national museums sort of going gangbusters now. Every little country wants something, right? Turkmenistan just opened up its national museum. Pakistan National Museum has just opened up recently. Fine. That's okay. I'm not saying we shouldn't have it, but we should understand the consequences and basically realize that that's maybe not the exact answer if we're trying to understand it globally. So then, of course, we have heritage sites. Everyone loves a heritage site. They make good money for you if you're, a country. So, we want to sort of have as many as possible. The race to heritage is the latest call in the international world. Even though UNESCO did recently say that they're not going to do any more heritage sites in Italy. It's finished. It's just embarrassing. Everybody, of course. But everyone else is sort of rushing madly to get their own heritage sites. Heritage sites are embedded in sort of often nationalistic projects of national representation and of national prestige and national pride. So, you add it all up, you have national art history problem, you have the national museums, and now we got World Heritage. Every country has to have World Heritage sites. And this creates problems in the interpretational strategies that we need to understand in global history. So I'm just giving you an example. This is the Leon in South Korea. Was there for the opening with Ram some 5 or 6 years ago. But these three museums, Museum of Modern Art, Museum of Contemporary Art, and Museum of Traditional Korean Art, all sounds particularly sort of reasonable. Okay, that's the way the world is fractured out. The website shows here the permanent exhibition of traditional art, and here another exhibition and you can't read it very well, but what it says is the Leon, a company, I don't know, Leon, it's not a company, it should be a company, whatever you want. I'm sorry, I don't quite get the English here. Anyway, it says, accompanying the flow of modern and contemporary art in the world. Something odd, but something lost in translation. But the point, of course, is the word flow, right? Which is, of course, the word that we really like these days. So, of course, we assume the modern word is a flow. The old word is sort of traditional. There's nothing flowing in the traditional world. And we're the one who are flowing. Well, my point is, it's exactly the opposite. We are not flowing. We're all about staticness. Ever since the 19th century invention of the modern nation state and the Treaty of Vienna of 1815, which is the most important treaty in the formation of our global heritage, global world, that no one has ever heard of. Probably never. Anybody heard of the Treaty of Vienna of 1914? But basically, it created the idea of the modern state, which was static, fixed, permanent borders, and sort of a government into itself. Right? So this idea of permanent borders, and it was basically designed and made against Napoleon. Napoleon went through Europe and wanted a big international Europe, of course, controlled by him, with no borders like the EU today. So something like that. And there was this reaction against that. So countries were fixed, protected by international law. Border was a border. And of course, the Europeans then went around the world and put borders everywhere they put borders and screwed up the whole world because of that. So in some sense, we live in a world that is sort of fetishizes, if you will, the project of permanence, and yet we sort of somehow have a strange notion that it's us who are doing the flowing. So we always assume traditional art is permanent versus the contemporary, which is the flow, which flows sort of presumably forever. I mean, I don't know when the flow is going to stop. But in reality, I'm saying just the opposite. So I'm producing a curatorial project, which is to take everything that's in this museum, and we're going to put it in, but they're not going to let us do it. So this is a project that we're doing in Seoul, but as a counter project. And we're going to put it in the contemporary art to show how contemporary all these pieces were at their time. And we're going to take everything that's in the modern museum, and we're going to put it into the traditional art, museum, to show that everything that we think is modern is actually traditional within the tradition of the modern nation state. Because the difference between modern and traditional is completely sort of arbitrary and a dysfunctional aspect of our own proto-nationalist projects that we've inherited from the 20th century. So that's why when we were doing our little story here about our love affair with the stonemasons traveling, we encountered, right, all of these questions. This is a story of flow. This is not a story of staticness. This is not a story that starts with India, and it's about India, and then next door is something Cambodia. This is a story about a larger geopolitical event in which architecture is flowing. And so that's the story that we need to sort of stay. So if we make our little heaps, right, we have the national art history, we have the museums, we have the world heritage, and we have countries with their traditional arts stiff and frozen as if they are in no historical time at all. Well, I know one thing, and that is that that is not global. I almost want to say, thank you very much. But we need to really sort of understand that global is a desire that we have. It is something that we want to teach, something that we want to sort of research and figure out. But we also have to understand how we, in our generation, is producing worlds that is continuously sort of getting in the way of that. So there are two sort of conclusions. One is that traditions today have become more and more static, more and more alienated from the flows and pulls and pushes that have conditioned them throughout time. And the second point is that history today is less global and more national. So the more global we come, the more we must struggle to defend global history, because global history is the place where we can actually see the dynamics of history in contradistinction to the sort of the undynamic world in which we live in today. Thank you very much. And I'll take questions.
Mark, I loved your architecture without borders. Great. There is an analogy there, perhaps a medical one, and I was wondering if you're willing to expound on it a little bit.
Dr. Lover issue?
Yes.
I don't know anything about them except the great name and the title.
Right. But obviously, you're somehow linking to it.
Oh,
and
well,
I was
yes.
wondering if you can just expound on how an architecture without borders would heal buildings, bring them together, revive them from the emergency situation they're in.
That's true, that's right. The only difference would be an architecture without borders, and architectural history project without borders, right, would encounter a lot of friction, probably more so than the doctors without borders, because they come sort of cheap and good and are sort of protected by their non-alliances. Whereas what we need here is a type of architecture without borders and a conception of art history and space without borders. But you rub up against the insistence everywhere of the legitimacy of borders again and again, like whether it's heritage, industry, tourism, art historical project, and so on. So it's a bit even a harder thing to do. In other words, it requires a stronger spine to sort of not get seduced by the premises that are out there that are reinforced in so many different ways. And to find avenues to sort of avoid it, and not get sort of pulled into it at the same time. But in some sense, it's a similar type of ethos. Right? I do hope, ultimately, in some utopian sense, that if we could survive, I'm not sure that we can survive what we're seeing. Right? In other words, we're in a moment where we can imagine something different than what we're getting in global today. We're getting in global today, not always, I'm not everywhere, I'm not totalizing it completely, but in a large sense, is the not global in the global world. It's not happening what's happening at Harvard or MIT right here, right? Just when you travel in the world, right? Is global going to happen in India, in Uzbekistan, in Russia, in France, in Brazil, right? And my conjecture is, well, not. Because we have to survive, in some sense, the resistance to that, even here in the United States. Because if we're producing history in the wrong way, then the production is itself a global problem. So, I get up in the morning and I go, I'm going to just after, but by the time I get my third beer, this and the middle of the night, I'm going to just do it.
The paradox is that some of these national histories were actually made in the first place to defend themselves from this very egocentric notion.
Absolutely, that's right. That's the problem, because they were meant as a defense mechanism to say, listen, we have these things, and you have to sort of build in a acceptance to that.
I'm sorry, can you
Because you have to
finish
see
what
that-
you said? I don't know what.
That many of the sort of historical reclamation, if you will, of the local and the local history was made in opposition to its being dismissed by sort of Eurocentric history. Right? And in some sense, the recuperation process, right, is very important and valuable, right? So it's really good and important, when I went to Ethiopia, that Ethiopians were trying to figure out what their history is. At the same time, when I did my research on one of the sites there, and I pointed out that, I mean, who knows because there's no documents, that this project might have been influenced by something that happened in India, they were very upset. They said, no, that can't be because we invented it. And I'm saying, why? The evidence is that there was this exchange between India and Ethiopia for hundreds of years, right? So can't one follow these trades and assume that there was some sort of exchange? So they were glad that I came down and listened, but then at the end they were going, oh my God, we were giving away the store because they want to show Ethiopianness of Ethiopia. And my article was sort of really, doing sort of global history. So that's the ambivalence you get, right? And it's something one has to sort of delicately and respectfully deal with, but also figure out a way to critique it. And not just sort of silence it over, because then we can't get past it either.
In order to rewrite this history in such a comprehensive scale, there's also something to be said about research and scholarship, right? I mean, to get the facts right, to get the maps precise enough and all that. I mean, we do need a lot of research and scholarship. And given the trends in the decline of humanities and the decline of architectural scholarship, how optimistic you are about rewriting history within the state of humanities now in the United States?
Well, it's not a pretty picture. And all I can say is I hope that every architect goes out somewhere in the world and finds something and writes about it. And I think as architects, we can see things in different ways than historians or art historians or literary or cultural historians that actually link certain things. But you're right. I mean, I think the decline of humanities endangers this. I was talking just to Bob, or to the students a little bit, about Africa. There's so little scholarship on Africa. There's one book on African architecture. I mean, one book. I mean, it's scary, right? So, and then there's lots of people who talk about architectural things, but they're not architectural historians, and so we don't have plans, we don't have sections. When we went to Ethiopia, we had to draw our own plans of buildings, we made our own sections, which is like, there's 150 degrees, and I've only got a week here, and why hasn't this been done? I mean, it's like, even when we went to India to draw a section through the Bhubaneswar temple, we had to do it ourselves, because no one had ever done it. I mean, you think, how can you teach that section? No one had ever made a section. So we're just missing, even fundamental, rudimentary things to use in teaching aids. And the missing aspect of it is sort of, you realize why things are missing also as well. It has a lot to do not only with sort of the dismissal, but also with the photography. You have millions of pictures of things, right? But no one draws anymore, right? No one makes measured drawings. I mean, up until 20 years ago, you still have had measured drawings. Now, only measured drawings in Angkor are made by archaeologists who will measure, 10 feet with 1 millimeter details. But the building is 1.5 miles long. So when I want to show a section through that, it doesn't exist. There's no section through Angkor, which is one of the great buildings of all time. Right? And if this were Shakti Cathedral and there was no section through it, we wouldn't even teach. You see, it's so frustrating because part of it is the materiality, our own materiality that we need to make these buildings meaningful often doesn't exist. And so we wind up either showing a picture or talking about things that come from other disciplines, from archaeology, and they're slightly different things. So we need a lot of people on the ground, a lot of boots on the ground, a lot of enthusiasm. If we want to do global, we should really be excited about it, go in the world, make measured drawings, that would be sort of one thing. Analyze the context, just get information. And that's where architects could come in handy. And of course, there's the historical project, and more historians that are doing this stuff.
Kind of related to what you just said, but also in general, it seems that the kind of problems you're describing are more problems of architecture history as a discipline or as a field, and not architecture itself. So I'm just wondering whether you think that the discipline of design is facing the same issues that the discipline of architectural history is facing in your opinion.
Well, I think I don't want to get into long tirades about contemporary situations.
No, please do.
Well, I think what we have is a little bit like this, why I showed the Leon building. Right? We have, in some sense, this split, which is now sort of legal and everywhere, it's all over the world, right? This idea that the contemporary is on one side and the historical is on the other side. And this is institutionalized in buildings, right? These buildings need curators. The curators speak, the public listens. They go, oh, that's modern, that's traditional. And it just goes out until finally you can't even fight that battle anymore. You tell people, that tradition is a concoction of the modern world, no one will believe you, right? Because they'll think you're nuts, right? And you say tradition and modern, or traditional or contemporary, or empty signifiers, right? That are sort of useless, in fact, in today's world. Right? Then they'll say, well, what else would you do? Right? So that's why I'm saying, just switch them, and I'll prove the point, right? That, you know, when Borobudur was built, it was contemporary. It was a modern building. It was the latest technology, the latest advances in thinking and analysis and in design, right? So why are we putting it down as tradition? Right? Or elevating it in front of a funny sidetrack of tradition? So that's sort of a problem with work. And so it impacts the other side too, which is the contemporary. Right? So every time we think of contemporary as being somehow separate from all this, we're actually producing that bad duality again and again. So the point is you know, to always remember, if you think I'm doing something contemporary, ask yourself, could I prove that everything I'm doing is traditional? Could I prove that you were really, you know, traditional just for the joke of it? You know, and probably, you know, it could be done relatively easily. So these words have to be just wiped off the face of our, you know, analysis. Right? We can't even use these words as far as I'm concerned. Traditional should be just not even used. Contemporary, okay, I can understand the tacticalness, but as a sort of category or thought in production, one should sort of stay away from that, you know, like the plague, and things like that. So we need to sort of look at our vocabulary as opposed to relying on vocabulary, get rid of some of these words. I think that would be helpful.
And actually, don't I mean, I think that your class was a design class, but it was not an architectural class, it was an architectural class. And you were only talking about design, just with a bigger, longer span, time base, span of increases.
Yeah, I don't see this as sort of history lesson, right? You know, we're architects, we don't maybe build in stone anymore, right? But we live in a world that is all about flow, right? And the point is to see how that actually, how we used to do that, right? Now, it's not that we should go up and build stone buildings, but we should sort of see how, in some sense, in fact, our contemporary world actually helps us better, to be better historians. Less sort of fixated, you know, on
I guess, like to rephrase, if you replace stone with software, I would see our time as still a moment of this flow and exchange, perhaps. But as far as like looking at problems of institutionalizing of history, like that's where really I think you see the problem to be. Whereas, I mean, I was just wondering whether you see that with architectural education being the same or not.
I think so. It could be. There are parallels all over. You know, I mean, I think history is always part of us. It's not sort of in the class, in the lecture hall, and then we stop in history when we sort of. And even the word history is now becoming so weird to even say that anymore, because history is tradition, is boring, is static, is, you know, all those things, right? Which it is not. History's never been that. History's always been dynamic. And somehow we just get into our head that history is sort of a static thing, right? A few days and facts and sort of got it.
Yeah, no, just the ramifications of a world without borders in terms of the academies, I think being one of the strongest implementers of borders. Because all of a sudden, then what would the state of scholarship look like if your model of history were to be able to really be fully manifest?
Yeah, I don't know. That's what we're asking, so to speak, right? And these are just two examples. I mean, I've got 8, 9, 10. I mean, it goes on and on and on. You know.
But what would the educational project look like then? I mean, we wouldn't have your Chinese expert and your Japanese expert, and you'd have what? I mean, that starts. You know, with your question, Ezra, of what is then scholarship? What, you know, where do you get the depth and, you know, all that kind of rigor you have in
We have to
scholarship?
operate at many different places. We have to operate at the scholarly level, at the pedagogical level, at the linguistic level, right? We have to, I mean, I did a study with a colleague of mine in Korea of architectural education in Korea, India, China, and you know, where you're required to take Japan, you're required to take Japanese traditional architecture. and in Korea you take Korean traditional architecture. So we sort of said, well, what happened if when did that happen? When did all of a sudden Korean student architect students have to take a course, a hard course in Korean traditional architecture? And what does that mean? Why can't they take a course on traditional Indonesian architecture? And the guys in Indonesia take a course on traditional Korean architecture, for example, right? Wouldn't that be sort of more interesting, right? As opposed to reaffirming once again your sort of your national authenticity for these things. Right? So this is our challenge that we're writing up for our article in JAE, to just sort of say, well, I mean, we sort of assume it's completely natural in Japan to take a course in Japanese architecture. In Canada, it's not just an Asian thing. In Canada, their NAB requires that professors mention Canadian architecture, I don't know, I think 5 times a semester, then they have to actually document it. You know, they build the Canadian buildings that they mention. You know, I mean, that's like, I mean, it's complete silliness that we've got into this sort of state here. You know, because then if you want to do, you can't do it now, but they've got to talk about Canadian. They were asking me, we didn't put any Canadian buildings in your book, and we can't really use it. Okay, we'll fix it next time. We'll mention one. You know, I don't know. You know, I mean, so that's really a big problem.
As far as just the overall importance of this idea of global history, do you see it as righting wrong or an ethical thing of you know, the global utopian idea, or to further education right now? I mean, I can see it because you said you're passionate. I mean, you are passionate about this. Like, where's your passion? Which one of these do you see that this is helping the most, as opposed to how things are?
I guess the last part of the question, which one do you see as?
Which one do you see? Where do you see the like true importance of global history?
Well, I think that we're, in a sense, you know, it was like a looking glass. We can sort of see what we want to do, but we can't taste it, we can't smell it. It's like we're somehow there, like boom, like all of a sudden there are these sort of glass boxes. And I want to break those glass boxes and see what comes out. It'd be just different. We don't know yet because there's not enough people populating the problem. So what we need is more people populating the problem. Right? And then when we can break these glasses in different ways, we'll have a much more open experimental field. Right now, it's sort of global without the experimentalism. And which is sort of like not what globalism is. Globalism is to shake up all this stuff, right? And not reaffirm 19th century images. And that's sort of a little bit what we're doing because it's comfortable. And we should sort of try to figure out how to make ourselves even uncomfortable. Right? That's where I'm being passionate.
I'm curious to hear about the relationship between the transfer of technique and the transfer of style. Because in your talk, you mentioned the techniques are finding the texture. And it's really clear to see the texture between things that are fairly similar in style, like as a whole, right? But then on a softer material, it makes it easier to transfer decisions about style. And there are also moments where you show the preservation of style. Just curious to hear about
any kind of transfer, and with transfer style, transfer techniques, and it doesn't even have to be, I mean, even, I'm a little bit more interested in actually sort of technology transfers, if you will, at the time, right? How iron transformed architectural production. Without iron, you wouldn't have had the product. And things like that, right? Different. So that's sort of a little bit my own interest. But it doesn't have to be. There are certain form issues. You know, one can look at how the mandala starts moving around and shape things. One can look how the stupa starts in India and becomes a pagoda or the ta in China, working its way then, you know, through Korea and Japan. That's a great story. But So there anything, I would say, that gets us outside of these sort of borders, is works for me. It doesn't, we don't, I mean, it all depends a little bit what you want. If I'm talking to an architectural audience, I'll say one thing. If I'm talking to artists, maybe I may say something else. If I'm talking to my grandmother, but we need more of these stories and not less.
You've defined your scope as widely as possible, and it's impossible to include everything. I wonder how you begin to make arguments for, say, specific stories like the Armenian story over others. What becomes your sorting mechanism, and how does that reflect a certain position or point of view?
That's right. Well, that's why we need more, right? My little mini story is just like one example, right? But there are other ways even to tell that story. And in fact, I have I do have another way to tell it, even myself. But that is just, I'm only one person. So we need multiple variants of that. And I just tell it because I had to write a book, I had to figure something out, and I had to say something, right? So that's what I came up with, so to speak. But clearly, we need more thought, more analysis, more, more the better. It really is. I mean, it's not the only way to talk about this. The point is just to make sure that we're layering on these projects in ways that always have the global in mind, as opposed to falling back to the company. That's one thing I'm saying. That doesn't mean that, someone, if you will, there are scholars out there like to work on Angkor and have done the research on Angkor and have made it, there are 6 books on Angkor. And they're unbelievable, and they're great. I mean, that's what archaeologists and these scholars do in their entire lives, is produce that. One needs that. That's why I showed the first slide, which was all the pieces that you need. That doesn't mean one shouldn't read it. That doesn't mean we simply shouldn't study it or check these books out and make it happen. But if the discussion is global, then that's not enough. If the discussion is the history of Angkor and how it was built and how its design was laid out and so forth, then those books are great. But if you want to talk about the relationship between Angkor and India and Persia, then those books are not great because they don't even mention it. So that's the other part of the coin, if you will, to the problem that I'm trying to sort of expose. So we have a lot of excellent localist history being produced, and if you want to teach in that way, then one should. But I'm saying, since it seems we don't want to teach in that way anymore, then we're faced with many of these problems. So the more people who are out there measuring, looking, writing, the better it is.
Given that I can't imagine the answer is that they're like, what is your speculation on the politics of now changing the requirement to global?
You mean, will they change the net requirement?
They did, right? So the point is it that they're super enlightened, or is it that there's a politics to redescribe
They changed it completely the wrong way. They put us back into the 19th century.
meaning identity politics?
Yeah, that's right. They say you have to teach global, and then they say, first thing they say is indigenous. Right? Okay, we do have to teach indigenous architecture. I'm writing a book about it now. That's not saying we don't, but that's not global. The idea that global is poor people living in huts is sort of a funny 19th century romantic notion, right? That primitive people out there, that's when we travel in our colonial ship, we wind up, in Africa, they're primitive people, that's global. That's what I mean, it's completely nuts. And then they say it's vernacular. That's the next thing they list, that's what we should teach. Anybody know what a vernaculum is? What the word means? It's a Latin word, vernaculum. Vernaculum is a slave quarter at the back of a Roman villa. So the Romans had these big villas, they had long gardens, and at the back was a shack where the slaves lived, out of sight and out of mind. That's a vernaculum. So why are we using this word? How did that word that's obscene, right, get completely washed of its historicalness? and use now, we teach vernacular history, vernacular architecture as if, oh, that's really good, you know? And no one has ever looked it up in the OED. I mean, I didn't like invent this, right? You know, it's just like, all you have to do is look at the OED. And you know, it tells you vernacular, and it gives you some sources, and I looked it up, and this is and sure enough, that's what it is. Right? So you know, it happened in a very accidental way with some English historians who were looking at language, and vernacular was used in the 19th century to talk about language, and then the guy said, oh, I'm talking about modern, I'm going to talk about vernacular, and then someone said, oh, vernacular, wow, that's really cool. Didn't know his languages. Right? There's a linguist know about language, and then someone who didn't know about language picked it up. Right? And then it became common, and then architects don't critique their own languages. And so we're using this word, which should be illegal. Right? Just as history should not be used, contemporary should be interrogated and questioned. Certainly vernacular, my God. I mean, you know, we have to call it something. Right? We do have to call it something. Well, let's maybe call it a bull's barn or something, but vernacular is, I just cringe at just the thought of how we have just used words without even thinking about it. And then if we say that's global, that's just adding insult to injury, right? So the NAB, I don't know what they've done to us. They've sort of really put us in the sort of swamp of really a very odd 19th century worldview and calling that wrong. So they need to be chastised, critiqued, and humiliated. I don't know what else to do. I mean, you know, this has to change. I mean, they should be chastised, humiliated for all other reasons too. At least one that I know about. Okay.